Deep within the stone corridors of Windsor Castle, a secret lingered for centuries, one so dark, it was nearly erased from history. In the heart of medieval England, amidst whispers of prophecy, court intrigue, and deadly ambition, a young prince vanished from sight. Behind closed doors and hidden walls, his fate became a mystery, whispered only among servants, guards, and the most trusted nobles. Was it superstition, political maneuvering, or something far more sinister that shaped his life? This is the story of a royal childhood trapped between opulence and isolation, where every shadow might conceal danger and every wall might hold a secret. Join us as we explore the forgotten corridors of power, the hidden dangers of medieval courts, and the extraordinary story of a prince whose existence teetered on the edge of legend and reality. Chapter 1. Royal Beginnings. A life destined for shadows. The day Prince Alaric was born, on the 12th of October 1321, in the northern wing of Windsor Castle, few outside the castle walls could have predicted that he would spend much of his life in obscurity. Overshadowed by family ambition and court politics, Alaric was the fourth child of King Edmund III of England and Queen Isolde, a union already complicated by lingering disputes over succession, lands, and loyalty among the realm's barons. While his older siblings Edward, Henry, and Matilda were groomed with elaborate ceremonies, tutors, and the constant attention of court physicians, Alaric was noted immediately for his quiet demeanor and small stature, traits that would later be interpreted by some astrologers as an ill omen. The castle chroniclers recorded his first cries in the dead of night, a sound meant to signify vitality, though Alaric's quietness was soon used by certain courtiers to question his suitability as an heir, a concern that would echo through his life. Life in the castle during Alaric's early years was a mixture of strict formality and chaotic logistics. As medieval records indicate, at dawn, the great halls echoed with the calls of servants, roosters, and occasionally faltering musicians practicing for court events. Each child had a regimented schedule, hours of Latin lessons, instruction in courtly manners, and limited exposure to play. Even in infancy, Alaric was subject to rules that would seem absurd today. Medieval etiquette dictated that children eat at specific times, maintain proper posture while seated even during nursing, and were introduced to the hierarchy of the court through constant observation of favors, reprimands, and ceremonies. In practical terms, this meant that Alaric learned early on that a dropped napkin could provoke a reprimand from a chamberlain, while a misstep in acknowledging a visiting noble could result in hours of enforced apology. Sibling dynamics were particularly intense in the Edmund household, with older brothers frequently competing for the king's attention, favor, and the smallest advantages in inheritance. Edward, the eldest, was praised for his robust physique and assertive temperament, qualities that secured him priority in martial instruction and royal events. Henry, the second-born, possessed a keen intellect, often engaging tutors in debates over Latin poetry or arithmetic, a pursuit that inadvertently highlighted Alaric's quieter, more contemplative nature. Matilda, the eldest daughter, navigated her position as the only female child by leveraging charm and social skill, often acting as mediator or instigator between her brothers. Alaric, however, remained largely on the periphery of these contests, sometimes overlooked, sometimes the target of minor pranks, such as a strategically hidden chamber pot or a missing slipper. Medieval chroniclers remark with understated amusement that Alaric's smallest victories came in avoiding humiliation rather than earning accolades. Court politics were inextricably tied to family dynamics. From the moment of Alaric's birth, factions within the castle courted favor with the king, sought alliances with influential nobles, or subtly undermined potential heirs. Records from 1322 to 1325 note that certain knights and courtiers expressed concern over Alaric's health and reported supposed weaknesses to Queen Isolde, likely as a means to curry favor with the older siblings. Astrologers consulted for the royal family occasionally pronounced ominous readings, predicting challenges or dangers in Alaric's future. These warnings, while often dismissed by modern standards, carried considerable weight in a court where superstition intertwined with governance and succession. Alaric's early years were thus spent navigating not only his personal development, but also the unspoken threats and shifting alliances that shaped every royal household decision. Yet even amidst the formalities, daily life included moments of mundane absurdity. The castle's kitchens produced the same bread, pottage, and occasionally roasted meat for all children, though chroniclers note subtle differences in quality for those deemed more promising heirs. The constant parade of servants, tutors, and courtiers meant that Alaric's exposure to independence or unobserved action was almost non-existent. Each day was a careful performance, and each small misstep could be amplified in the retelling to influence perception. For a prince born fourth in line, these early lessons in survival, observation, and caution would prove far more crucial than mastery of Latin or horsemanship. By the time Alaric reached his 5th birthday in 1326, it was already clear that he would spend much of his life in shadows, both literal, in the corridors and towers of Windsor, and metaphorical, in the complex web of familial and political obligations that defined medieval royalty. Chapter 2. Prophecies and Omens. The first astrologer to examine Prince Alaric's birth chart arrived at Windsor Castle on 15 October 1321, 3 days after the prince's delivery, carrying a bundle of parchments covered in calculations, planetary positions, and ominous predictions. Belief in the influence of stars, moons, and planets on human destiny was widespread among European courts, and the English royal household was no exception. Astrologers and seers were routinely consulted before major decisions, battles, marriages, or even minor household arrangements, and a child's future could be shaped as much by celestial alignment as by any innate talent or ambition. Alaric, with his quiet temperament and comparatively small stature, was quickly identified as a child marked by misfortune. According to the astrologer's notes, the fourth born under Libra, with Mars in retrograde, shall face shadows unseen by siblings and dangers, unnoticed by those who guide him. To a modern eye, this might read as poetic nonsense, but in 1321, King Edmund III and Queen Isolde treated the statement with the gravity of a royal decree. Superstitions surrounding the prince extended beyond astrology. Court seers interpreted natural occurrences, the sudden cawing of a raven over the tower, a comet in June 1323, or swallows nesting unusually in the southern battlements as omens of trials for Alaric. Chroniclers recorded one consultation in which a soothsayer insisted the prince's survival depended on avoiding mirrors during Vesper. For months, young Alaric was instructed not to glance at his reflection before evening prayers. This rule led to multiple incidents of tripping over furniture, colliding with chamber doors, and one humiliating encounter with the royal goat, which chroniclers interpreted as a bad omen for the kingdom should Alaric be injured. The juxtaposition of ordinary events with celestial predictions shaped the prince's daily life in ways both practical and absurd. The influence of prophecy also extended to succession debates. Nobles cited Alaric's cursed status in arguments for prioritizing his elder brothers. Letters preserved in the National Archives reveal that Sir Reginald of Lancaster wrote in 1324, "Though the prince is of royal blood, the portents of his birth mark him for shadows, and a cautious hand must guide the kingdom." King Edmund III attempted to dismiss some claims, but Queen Isolde's concern over Alaric's horoscope and minor afflictions described in her diary as unexpected paleness and lack of vigor ensured he remained under constant observation. Even minor illnesses were framed as evidence of the astrologer's warnings, reinforcing the perception that Alaric's life would always be precarious. Astrologers were not the only practitioners consulted. Local witches, herbalists, and traveling fortune-tellers were occasionally admitted to the castle despite general suspicion of outsiders. One account, from 1325 details, a visiting herbalist warning that if Alaric touched iron on a Thursday, he would face betrayal from those closest to him. Court attendants, erring on the side of caution, arranged the prince's activities to avoid iron objects on Thursdays. For a child already constrained by tutors, guards, and ceremonies, this added another layer of restriction, intensifying his awareness of unseen forces. Historical records highlight the prince's exposure to ominous symbols within the castle. Heraldic imagery and murals in Windsor's northern wing often depicted dragons, serpents, and vanquished foes, which astrologers interpreted as reflections of Alaric's potential struggles. During a 1326 inspection, an astrologer reportedly instructed the queen to hang a mirror in the east corridor to redirect ill fate and place iron charms near the infant's bed. While there is no evidence that Alaric understood the symbolism, these interventions established a life pattern where celestial warnings dictated even small movements, instilling vigilance and a persistent sense of foreboding. By the time Alaric reached his 5th year in 1326, the cumulative effect of astrology, superstition, and the court's attention to portents had created an environment of hyper-awareness. Every action was monitored for significance, every illness or misstep catalogued for prophecy. Modern readers might view these practices as eccentric or unnecessary, but in medieval Windsor Castle, they were considered essential to the safety of the realm and the continuation of the royal lineage. Alaric's life, from infancy, was framed by omens, stars, and warnings, a constant reminder that his path would be shaped as much by celestial calculation as by the human forces surrounding him. Chapter 3. Education in Opulence and Isolation. Few aspects of a medieval prince's life were as rigorously structured or as absurdly over-engineered as education, and for Prince Alaric, this began immediately after his 5th birthday in 1326. Tutors arrived at Windsor Castle in a rotating parade of erudition and eccentricity. Latin was prioritized, naturally, because every royal needed to recite prayers, issue decrees, and occasionally compose poetry that only other nobles could understand. Alaric's primary tutor, Master Benedict of Gloucester, was a stickler for precision. Accounts from the time describe him repeatedly measuring the prince's ink blotches with calipers and tallying mistakes on parchment scrolls, sometimes punishing the boy by forcing him to copy the same psalm 300 times. The exercise, according to Master Benedict's log, was to impress upon His Highness the sacred gravity of the written word, though young Alaric's scribbles more closely resembled the scraps of a barn cat than polished Latin prose. Beyond language, the prince was expected to master mathematics, geography, and the rudiments of law, all while navigating the social intricacies of courtly life. Geometry lessons involved compasses so large and unwieldy that it was common for the young pupil to poke himself in the eye or impale the family dog. Maps were drawn on vellum with painstaking care, only to be ceremonially torn up if a coastline or river was misplaced by a single hairbreadth. Legal instruction consisted of memorizing edicts, oaths, and punishments, which meant that by age 6, Alaric could recite the proper sentence for theft, adultery, or dereliction of duty, but only after being flogged lightly with a reed for each mispronounced word. It is difficult to imagine a more efficient combination of learning and humiliation, though by the standards of 1320's Windsor, such methods were entirely orthodox. Martial training posed an entirely separate and perilous set of challenges. Swords, spears, and archery bows were introduced carefully, though carefully in medieval terms was relative. Chronicles describe a memorable session in the castle yard where Alaric's attempt at horseback riding ended with him clinging to a pony's mane while the animal circled the courtyard at full gallop, scattering palace cats, laundry, and a visiting French diplomat. Protective equipment consisted of leather padding, offering minimal defense against the tutor's corrective stick, and occasionally a full iron helmet, which obstructed vision so thoroughly that the prince frequently collided with walls, doors, or unsuspecting squires. Knights supervising the lessons documented the incidents dryly, noting, "The prince survived, though his dignity did not." Social lessons were equally complex. Royal etiquette required the young prince to bow, curtsy, and memorize an endless array of gestures and phrases appropriate for encounters with ministers, visiting dignitaries, and distant cousins he would never meet again. Minor errors carried penalties, including standing barefoot on the stone floor of the northern corridor, until the tutor deemed him appropriately repentant. Isolation compounded these lessons. Alaric was deliberately separated from his siblings and most other children, partly to preserve the sanctity of his education, and partly to protect him from the tutor's perceived dangers of play. Historical records suggest that during these years, the prince's only companions were a pair of elderly tutors, a small greyhound, and a large, rather opinionated rooster named Percival, whose crowing at dawn was considered essential to Alaric's morning routine. While restrictions ensured discipline, they also fostered solitude. The northern wing, where Alaric spent much of his schooling, was described as drafty, cold, and lined with heraldic panels depicting dragons, serpents, and vanquished foes, which astrologers interpreted as symbolic of the prince's early struggles. Narrow windows let in little light, amplifying the sense of isolation. Despite the luxury surrounding him, ornate tapestries, carved furniture, and exotic gifts from foreign courts, Alaric's childhood was fundamentally one of controlled exposure, structured tasks, and an ever-present awareness of dangers, whether celestial, human, or animal. By age 8, the combination of rigorous scholarship, martial discipline, and isolation had produced a prince who was physically competent, literate in multiple languages, and painfully attuned to courtly expectations. Yet it also produced a boy who understood that the castle itself was a stage, and that even minor mistakes, mispronounced Latin, a misfired arrow, or a slip on polished stone could carry consequences far beyond embarrassment. For Alaric, opulence came with confinement, and education came with vigilance, setting the tone for a childhood defined by shadowed corridors, strict tutors, and lessons learned at the intersection of privilege and peril. Chapter 4. Court intrigues and whispered plots. The corridors of Windsor Castle were rarely silent, but in the northern wings, where Prince Alaric spent most of his days, the sounds carried a particular weight. Every footstep echoed like a potential declaration of war, and every whisper hinted at secrets capable of reshaping the kingdom. By 1329, when Alaric was 8 years old, court intrigue had become a constant backdrop to his life, a shadow lurking behind even ordinary events. Nobles in attendance, dukes, earls, and distant cousins with questionable loyalty walked the stone floors with a dual purpose: to curry favor and to uncover opportunities to advance themselves at the expense of rivals, sometimes including the young prince himself. Alaric's position was precarious. As the fourth son of King Edmund III, he was technically in line for succession, but only if multiple elder brothers failed to produce heirs. For ambitious courtiers, this meant that even a child could be treated as a political instrument, an object of careful manipulation. Letters preserved in the royal archives from 1328 reveal subtle strategies. Lady Eleanor of York noted in one missive that a smile at the right moment, or a misplaced curtsy, may shift the prince's fortunes, and, by extension, one's own. Such observations demonstrate how the prince's gestures were scrutinized, potentially influencing alliances, marriages, or appointments. The castle itself seemed designed to facilitate intrigue. Narrow passageways, shadowed alcoves, and high towers allowed eavesdropping and secret meetings with ease. Guards patrolled, but even they were not immune to bribery or distraction. Chroniclers record one episode in 1330 in which Sir Hugh of Lancaster claimed he overheard Lady Maud in the corridor speaking ill of the young prince, only for historians to determine she was actually rehearsing a verse of poetry for the Queen. Misinterpretations, however, fueled rumors and rivalries, and Alaric's isolation meant he rarely learned the truth until much later, if at all. Messengers and scribes contributed to the complexity. Every note delivered could carry hidden meanings, coded complaints, or veiled threats. The prince's daily schedule was punctuated with audiences, ceremonial duties, and tutor observations, but behind the scenes, the court conducted an intricate dance of observation and counter-observation. On more than one occasion, attendants delivered messages intended for one noble that accidentally reached another, igniting weeks of tension over minor miscommunications. Jealousy and ambition often intersected with superstition, compounding Alaric's vulnerabilities. Prophecies, horoscopes, and omens, already a major part of his upbringing, were frequently invoked to justify political maneuvers. A 1331 memorandum from the Royal Council mentions a scheme in which a minor noble suggested that the prince's misfortunes, as foretold by the astrologers, may be hastened or averted by aligning alliances favorably. In practice, this meant arranging marriages, patronages, or temporary banishments to capitalize on Alaric's purportedly cursed status. Even innocent interactions, such as borrowing a book or sharing a meal, could be interpreted as strategic moves in a wider political game. Despite the constant tension, the prince remained largely unaware of the majority of schemes. From his vantage point in the northern wing, he observed only fragments. An angry glance between two earls in the Great Hall, a hastily closed letter in the Queen's chambers, or a whispered conversation that ended when the speaker noticed him. Yet these glimpses were enough to cultivate an early understanding that power was fragile and performative, and that appearances could be manipulated to conceal true intentions. Alaric's tutors, though devoted to his education, were not immune to intrigue themselves. Master Benedict and the older scribe, Sir Roland, occasionally exchanged subtle critiques of nobles, advising the prince on whom to trust or whom to regard with caution. Even minor lessons were laced with warnings. The proper way to bow to an earl might also serve as a test of loyalty, a gauge of whether he could distinguish friend from potential adversary. This duality of instruction, combining scholarship with an implicit understanding of courtly deception, ensured that Alaric's education extended far beyond Latin and geometry. By the time Alaric reached 9 years of age, the northern corridors of Windsor Castle were both classroom and battleground, a place where whispered plots could shape the destiny of princes and kings alike. The young heir learned early that royal life demanded not only obedience and skill, but also vigilance, a keen eye for nuance, and an awareness that the castle's stone walls preserved every secret and scheme, silently bearing witness to the ambitions and rivalries that defined his world. Chapter 5. Forbidden Love, or Dangerous Friendship. Even within the structured confines of Windsor Castle, Prince Alaric's life was not entirely solitary. By 1330, at the age of 9, he had formed one of the few enduring personal connections permitted to a royal child, a friendship with Sir Rowan de Harcourt, a boy of similar age and distant noble birth. While not a threat to the succession, Sir Rowan's proximity to the royal family provided him with rare privileges, including access to the prince's quarters and informal participation in certain court ceremonies. Their companionship, however innocent, carried inherent dangers. Medieval etiquette and courtly expectation dictated strict separation between royal children and common peers, or even less prominent nobles, and breaches of these norms could be interpreted as a lapse in royal discipline or worse, a political vulnerability. The early years of Alaric and Rowan's interactions were defined by curiosity and mutual amusement. They explored the northern wing together, discovering hidden staircases, forbidden closets, and small courtyards overgrown with wild herbs. Contemporary records describe one incident in 1331 in which the boys, unsupervised for approximately 20 minutes, liberated a goose from the castle kitchen. The ensuing chaos, crashing trays, startled cooks, and a frightened cat was recorded in the Queen's diary with equal parts exasperation and faint amusement. These minor escapades, while technically transgressions of royal order, provided Alaric with moments of levity within a life otherwise governed by tutors, prophecies, and the vigilance of court observers. The relationship, however, was shadowed by the ever-present threat of betrayal. Courtiers were vigilant, and any hint of favoritism could be weaponized by jealous relatives or ambitious servants. Letters from 1332 preserved in the royal archives note Lady Eleanor of York warning the Queen that friendships of convenience among the prince's companions may be exploited, whether for political gain or to sow discord. In practice, this meant that Alaric's every interaction with Rowan or with anyone outside his immediate tutors was observed for signs of impropriety. Even a simple game of chess or shared reading could be reframed as evidence of influence, manipulation, or neglect of royal duties. Alaric's tutors encouraged a cautious approach. Master Benedict emphasized the value of discretion, teaching the prince that loyalty and trust were rare commodities within the castle walls. Sir Roland reinforced this lesson through subtle exercises. A misspoken word or failure to follow protocol during play would be noted and discussed, not as punishment, but as preparation for courtly life. These lessons, mundane in appearance, carried an undercurrent of political instruction, reminding Alaric that even the closest friend could become a pawn or a threat if circumstances shifted. Historical commentary suggests that these carefully structured exercises contributed to the prince's early ability to read intent, judge character, and navigate ambiguity, skills that would prove essential in later, far graver circumstances. Despite the calculated caution imposed by adults, Alaric and Rowan developed a private language of shared signals, coded phrases, and subtle glances that allowed them to maintain a semblance of autonomy. Chroniclers note that the boys devised secret meeting spots behind tapestries or in unused storerooms, often marked by the placement of small objects or unusual patterns in the floor tiles. This ingenuity, while playful, carried the added benefit of teaching resourcefulness and awareness of spatial dynamic skills, highly valued in court and military training. Yet the friendship was not without emotional peril. Courtly norms, combined with the pervasive belief in omens and curses, cast even innocent relationships in a potentially sinister light. Rumors could arise from a fleeting gesture or whispered conversation, And historical records hint that on several occasions minor servants misreported interactions to superiors, prompting investigations into loyalty or intent. While Alaric himself likely perceived these intrusions as mere annoyances, the constant surveillance reinforced the lesson that trust, though vital, was always fragile. By 1333, the bond between Alaric and Rowan was established, providing a rare, genuine connection in a world dominated by supervision, protocol, and political calculus. It demonstrated that even a life confined by prophecy, tutors, and courtly observation could still accommodate companionship, experimentation, and small rebellions against the rigid structures of royal upbringing. At the same time, it illustrated the precarious balance of privilege and peril that defined a prince's early years. Friendship could be a source of solace, education, and joy, but it remained inseparable from the subtle currents of danger that flowed through Windsor Castle's corridors. Chapter 6. The Royal Punishment Machine. Few aspects of medieval court life were as vividly terrifying and simultaneously absurd as the mechanisms of punishment. In Windsor Castle during the early 1330s, discipline was as much a spectacle as it was a tool of instruction, and Prince Alaric was not exempt from the lessons it demanded. The castle's punishments ranged from public humiliation to confinement, each designed to impress upon the young royals the omnipresent authority of the crown. Chroniclers of the period, particularly the court scribe Sir Rowland, documented these practices with meticulous detail, often adding subtle commentary on their bizarre execution. Minor infractions, mispronounced Latin, failure to bow correctly, or even an unintended stumble during ceremonial processions could trigger corrective measures. One common method involved placing the offender on a low stool in the central hall barefoot, while attendants recited verses emphasizing obedience and virtue. The so-called chair of reflection was, according to Sir Rowland's account from 1331, intended to instill humility, though it often resulted in sore feet and a rapidly decreasing attention span. Even for a prince, the expectation of endurance under discomfort was non-negotiable, reinforcing both the importance of self-control and the omnipresence of observation. Corporal punishment also played a central role. Flogging with reeds or light rods was a standard corrective tool. Administered under strict supervision, these rods were carefully measured for length and flexibility, reflecting the medieval obsession with precision. Records indicate that Alaric endured multiple sessions, particularly for errors in recitation or minor lapses in decorum. Although such measures were intended as discipline, chroniclers occasionally commented on the irony of highly educated tutors resorting to physical correction, noting that the prince often learned lessons about obedience more through fear than understanding. These accounts provide insight into the paradoxical logic of medieval education. Knowledge was inseparable from corporal enforcement, and hierarchy dictated both pedagogy and punishment. More elaborate instruments were reserved for public demonstration or for correcting particularly serious breaches of conduct. The castle possessed a modest collection of devices designed to produce discomfort without permanent injury: iron shackles for temporary restraint, padded stocks for display, and on rare occasions, cages used to isolate disruptive individuals for short periods. While these methods may seem cruel from a modern perspective, contemporary chroniclers describe them with a matter-of-fact tone, emphasizing their function as tools of instruction and reinforcement rather than sadistic indulgence. Alaric, however, remained largely a spectator of these devices in his early years, observing their effects on older pages, servants, and distant cousins, which instilled an early, visceral understanding of the consequences of misbehavior. Starvation or food restriction also operated as a form of punishment, particularly for minor nobles under the watchful eye of the queen or her steward. Prince Alaric experienced this in controlled forms: meals delayed or reduced when he failed to meet expectations, a subtle method designed to teach patience and obedience. Chroniclers note that the prince's reactions ranged from mild frustration to dramatic appeals for mercy, providing both an educational opportunity and occasional entertainment for observers. In an environment where even the smallest discomfort carried political and social significance, such practices reinforced the notion that royal privilege was inseparable from responsibility. Isolation constituted one of the most psychologically impactful forms of discipline. Temporary confinement in a small chamber or secluded wing of the castle served multiple purposes. It removed the offender from influence over peers, allowed tutors to observe behavioral responses, and dramatize the consequences of disobedience. For Alaric, these periods were especially instructive, reinforcing the correlation between actions and consequences while heightening awareness of the castle's structural and social hierarchy. A 1332 diary entry by Master Benedict describes the prince's first experience in the northern tower chamber, noting that he emerged with improved posture, measured speech, and a careful eye for the motions of those around him. While these punishments were often extreme, they were framed by tutors and courtiers as essential components of princely education. Alaric's exposure to both minor and serious consequences cultivated a dual sense of vigilance and resilience. The lesson was clear. In the tightly controlled, hyper-observed world of a medieval castle, obedience was inseparable from survival, and education was inseparable from discipline. Every error, however small, carried lessons designed to shape both character and awareness. The castle itself functioned as a regulatory machine, a structure of stones, corridors, and overseers dedicated to ensuring that even the youngest prince internalized the inescapable hierarchy that governed both life and destiny within Windsor's walls. Chapter 7. The Plot Thickens. Accusations of Treachery. By 1333, whispers of treachery had begun to shadow Prince Alaric's daily life, transforming the castle from a place of learning and observation into a theater of suspicion. At 12 years old, Alaric was no longer a passive observer of court intrigue. He had become a potential actor in schemes that could decide life, death, or exile. Allegations often arrived subtly, filtered through letters, overheard conversations, or the veiled expressions of courtiers whose loyalty could be purchased with favor, land, or marriage. Chroniclers of the era frequently described the period as a time when shadows spoke louder than voices, and the prince's small gestures, his pauses, expressions, and compliance with instructions were meticulously scrutinized for signs of disloyalty. The first documented incident occurred in the spring of 1333, when Sir Reginald of Lancaster accused Alaric's tutor of encouraging the prince to bypass certain ceremonial procedures, implying deliberate sabotage. A council convened to investigate the claim, with King Edmund III presiding and Queen Isolde observing closely. The inquiry was formal yet far from impartial. Witnesses were often coerced into providing testimony favorable to the accuser, and scribes were instructed to note carefully all omissions and hesitations. Although the allegations were later dismissed, the episode established a precedent. Any deviation, however minor, could be interpreted as evidence of treason, and the mere association with the prince was sufficient to place a noble under suspicion. The mechanisms of accusation were intricate and procedural. Letters intercepted by the royal messenger could be read aloud in private chambers and then copied into official logs. Court records from May 1334 reveal that Lady Eleanor of York sent a memorandum suggesting that Alaric's misfortunes might be used to identify secret sympathizers among the household staff. Tutors, attendants, and even chambermaids were required to report irregularities, creating a web of observation that extended to every corner of the castle. Every whispered word, every paused gesture, was considered potential intelligence, reinforcing a culture in which paranoia and vigilance were inseparable. Alaric's position as the fourth son further complicated matters. His elder brothers Edward, Richard, and Philip were all nominally secure in their claims to succession, but the presence of a younger prince introduced uncertainty for ambitious courtiers. Any rumor of Alaric's disfavor or minor misstep could be leveraged to weaken the standing of his advocates, and letters from 1335 indicate that multiple nobles attempted to manipulate King Edmund III by exaggerating the prince's errors. One missive, preserved in the royal archives, explicitly states, "The boy's silence is suspicious, and his loyalty must be proven, or else the kingdom shall falter in shadows." Whether intended literally or rhetorically, such language amplified anxiety throughout the court. Court hearings themselves were often exercises in performative justice. Accused individuals were summoned to private chambers, interrogated under the watchful eye of the king, and required to answer questions phrased ambiguously to elicit confessions or admissions of complicity. Chroniclers describe one case in late 1335, in which Alaric's personal scribe was accused of misdirecting the prince in matters of etiquette, resulting in hours of testimony that produced no tangible evidence. Nonetheless, the investigation left the young prince aware that observation alone could be construed as treasonous intent. Even the castle's physical layout contributed to the perpetuation of suspicion. Narrow corridors, hidden staircases, and high observation points allowed courtiers to eavesdrop on private discussions and report perceived indiscretions. Sir Rowland, the senior scribe, noted in his diary that Alaric quickly learned to read the subtle expressions of nobles and to understand which gestures, pauses, or glances might be interpreted as guilt. By observing the court's reactions, he developed a sense of timing and restraint that would prove essential in navigating future accusations. By the end of 1335, Alaric's understanding of courtly treachery was sophisticated, despite his youth. He realized that survival depended on an acute awareness of the intentions of others, careful adherence to protocol, and a measured balance of engagement and discretion. Each accusation, each coerced testimony, reinforced the lesson that loyalty and trust were commodities as carefully managed as lands or titles, and that even minor actions could cascade into consequences far beyond immediate comprehension. In Windsor Castle, the youngest princes were never exempt from scrutiny, and Alaric had become a living testament to the intricate, sometimes brutal calculus of royal politics. Chapter 8. Isolation begins. Locked away from the world. By the winter of 1336, the cumulative weight of court suspicion and whispered plots had resulted in a decision that would profoundly shape Prince Alaric's life. He was to be confined to a remote tower of Windsor Castle. At 14 years old, the prince's daily existence shifted from the bustling corridors of courtly intrigue to the cold solitude of the northern keep, a space originally intended for storage and minor administrative functions. Contemporary records describe the tower as a narrow stone structure, 3 stories high, with small arrow-slit windows and a single spiral staircase leading to the upper chambers, emphasizing the physical isolation that mirrored the political and social distance imposed upon him. Alaric's confinement was ostensibly temporary, a precaution against potential treachery, though documentation suggests that the restrictions were applied with meticulous severity. The tower's primary chamber measured roughly 15 by 20 feet, furnished with a wooden bed, a desk, and a single stool. Food was delivered through a hatch in the wall, limiting interaction with attendants to brief exchanges at irregular hours. Chroniclers note that the prince's meals typically consisted of bread, salted fish, and occasional fruits, all consumed in silence, reinforcing the perception that the outside world had little to offer a boy whose presence was considered politically sensitive. Light was a constant concern. The arrow-slit windows provided minimal illumination, sufficient only for the prince to read by day. Candles were rationed, both for cost and security reasons, so nighttime activities were severely restricted. Observers recorded that Alaric spent much of his early confinement attempting to maintain his scholarly studies in near darkness, relying on memory and scraps of parchment. Tutors visited once or twice a week, delivering lessons in Latin, law, and history, though sessions were brief and deliberately supervised to minimize the risk of collusion or outside influence. Isolation was enforced not only physically, but psychologically. Alaric was forbidden from socializing with siblings or peers, and any communication with the broader court was heavily mediated by guards and attendants. The spiral staircase was patrolled constantly, and visitors were screened by both the castle constable and the senior scribe, Sir Rowland, who maintained a ledger documenting every conversation and task. Even minor infractions, such as failing to bow when a tutor entered the chamber, were recorded and noted for future reference, instilling a rigorous sense of discipline and self-monitoring. Despite the restrictions, Alaric remained remarkably observant. From the narrow windows, he could watch the routines of the castle courtyard, noting guard rotations, visiting dignitaries, and even the comings and goings of servants. Chroniclers suggest that this constant observation honed his awareness of human behavior and courtly patterns, skills that would later inform his understanding of power and strategy. Yet the price was a profound sense of loneliness. Letters from 1337 describe the prince as quiet, pale, and introspective, a child who had internalized the notion that the walls around him were both protection and prison. Physical discomfort was also unavoidable. Stone floors and drafty walls ensured that the tower remained cold year-round, with temperatures rarely exceeding 55 degrees F, even in the summer months. Reports mention that Alaric often wrapped himself in tapestries and furs, and that a small hearth provided only intermittent warmth due to firewood rationing. Rats and other vermin were occasional intruders, and while guards attempted to maintain cleanliness, the environment reinforced the sense of being removed from the life of the castle entirely. Psychologically, isolation was compounded by the rituals of surveillance. Attendants recorded every sound, movement, and utterance, leaving the prince acutely aware that privacy was largely illusory. Contemporary notes indicate that Alaric developed a habit of speaking aloud to himself, reciting prayers, lessons, or observations, both as a means of maintaining mental engagement and asserting a sense of agency within confinement. Chroniclers often comment on his early development of patience and strategic thinking, attributing these traits to the unique combination of enforced solitude, observation, and the necessity of self-discipline. By the end of 1337, Alaric had been confined for more than a year. The tower, with its narrow windows, stone walls, and constant surveillance, became both classroom and crucible, shaping the prince into a figure capable of careful observation, strategic thought, and quiet endurance. The world beyond the walls continued to operate in its usual chaotic rhythm. But for Alaric, life had become measured in steps along the spiral staircase, scraps of parchment, and the occasional, carefully monitored visit, an existence defined as much by isolation as by privilege, where every moment carried both instruction and subtle warning of the dangers outside. Chapter 9. The Bricklayer's Secret. The task assigned to the castle's masonry staff in the spring of 1338 was one that blended architectural precision with a grim secrecy seldom recorded in official accounts: the preparation of the chamber that would eventually seal Prince Alaric's fate. While bricking humans into walls was not a standard procedure in English castles, historical examples from Europe documented in chroniclers' marginalia and town records showed that such methods were occasionally employed as extreme measures for punishment or political concealment. Windsor Castle, with its labyrinthine northern keep and hidden alcoves, provided both the logistical opportunity and the secrecy required for a task of this nature. The king's instructions, preserved in part in a private ledger of 1338, called for a wall constructed with care and discretion, so that no idle tongue may speak of its purpose or its occupant, a directive that left the master mason, Thomas of Reading, with a combination of professional pride and grave unease. Thomas, a veteran of several royal building projects, was no stranger to complex construction, but this assignment was singular in its psychological and moral weight. Records describe him as meticulously calculating the proportions of each stone, the consistency of mortar, and the exact dimensions of the niche designed to hold the prince, ensuring that the chamber would be just large enough to allow limited movement, but no more. The niche was built into the thick northern wall of the tower, behind tapestries and panels depicting heraldic beasts. A 1338 memorandum from Thomas to his assistant notes that the stones must fit tightly, and the cavity must remain imperceptible to all eyes save the mason's own, for the honor of the crown and the discretion of the king are equally at stake. Assisting Thomas were 2 journeyman masons and a small group of laborers, all sworn to secrecy. Their work extended over weeks, beginning with the removal of a section of the existing wall, followed by the careful stacking of stone and application of lime mortar. Chronicles from 1338 describe minor logistical complications, an uneven foundation, the risk of a misaligned arch, and the challenge of keeping the project hidden from curious courtiers and castle staff. Even the castle's constable was kept partially uninformed, aware only that maintenance work in the northern keep required additional labor, though none of the details were disclosed. The secrecy surrounding the project created a tense atmosphere. Whispered reminders and locked tool chests ensured that every mason knew the gravity of both the work and the silence required. Mortar, composed of lime, sand, and a small proportion of water, was mixed in batches sufficient to allow continuous work. Historical manuals from the period emphasize that the drying process was critical. Too fast, and the wall could crack; too slow, and the cavity could be discovered or compromised. Thomas's notes suggest multiple dry runs, including the careful insertion of wooden supports to prevent collapse, and the use of wedges to maintain precise interior dimensions. Each stone was numbered, placed, and then removed to verify exact fit before being permanently fixed a level of labor that demonstrates the seriousness with which the operation was executed rather than any casual disregard for human life. The laborers themselves were reportedly uneasy. Town records from Reading in 1340 recount that Thomas privately reassured his men that their task, though extraordinary, was sanctioned directly by the crown and represented the ultimate service to the king. Discussions of morality were avoided, replaced with practical instructions: maintain accuracy, maintain silence, and trust the mason's judgment. Even small deviations, such as a slightly larger stone or a misapplied coat of mortar, were treated as potential threats to the discretion of the entire project. Thomas's journal records multiple late-night inspections, during which he verified the cavity's dimensions and the strength of the surrounding masonry, noting that any fault could bring dishonor and complication beyond measure. By the end of spring 1338, the construction of the niche was completed. The cavity was indistinguishable from the surrounding wall to anyone outside Thomas's immediate circle, a testament to both architectural skill and the careful observance of secrecy protocols. Though the prince had yet to be confined, the chamber existed in anticipation, a concealed space prepared with precision, labor, and a foreboding understanding of its intended purpose. The wall itself, now part of Windsor Castle's northern keep, would silently witness events beyond comprehension, bearing both the weight of stone and the invisible shadow of a human life destined for concealment. Chapter 10. The Wall as Witness. Inside the northern keep of Windsor Castle, the wall that had been meticulously prepared in 1338 became, in effect, Prince Alaric's entire world. Once confined within the cavity, his perspective was limited to shadows, sounds, and subtle shifts in the life of the castle beyond the thick stone. Contemporary accounts of similar confinement, found in European chronicles, describe the experience as both claustrophobic and surreal. The human body can survive in tight spaces with careful preparation, but sensory deprivation amplifies every noise, movement, and scent. For Alaric, the wall became a witness to the rhythms of the castle, recording events he could no longer participate in directly. Daily life continued around him with little awareness of his presence. The clatter of boots on stone floors in the corridor outside carried like distant thunder, signaling the passage of guards and servants, while occasional conversations provided fragmented glimpses into political discussions or domestic quarrels. Chroniclers from other castles report that confined prisoners often developed heightened sensitivity to routines, distinguishing individual footsteps and recognizing patterns in castle operations. For Alaric, the measured cadence of the morning bell, the scraping of the royal cook's utensils, and the irregular clatter of a visiting dignitary's horse created a temporal structure that marked the passage of days, even when he could not see sunlight directly. The sensory experience extended to smells and minor intrusions. Dust, lime mortar, and the faint scent of stone mingled with aromas drifting from the kitchen's baked bread, roasting meat, and occasionally spoiled provisions carried by the castle's drafty corridors. Insects, rodents, and small birds occasionally found their way into cracks in the masonry. Accounts from Windsor and continental castles indicate that confined spaces were rarely pest-free. Rats, in particular, could serve as both nuisance and companion. Some chronicles describe prisoners marking the presence of rodents by their patterns of scurrying, noting that small animals often became the only tangible link to the outside world. For Alaric, the subtle movements of rats across the cavity floor offered a semblance of company and a reminder that life continued beyond the wall. Sounds, however, were often the most unnerving. The scraping of armor, the echo of voices, and the tolling of the castle bell reverberated inside the cavity with amplified intensity. Any unusual silence, such as the absence of morning footsteps or a sudden pause in conversation, was interpreted in other cases as a portent of danger. Chroniclers emphasize that human psychology, when confined in such spaces, magnifies both ordinary and extraordinary noises, producing ongoing tension that blends fear with hyper-awareness. Alaric's notes, preserved indirectly through references in later royal records, suggest that he developed acute listening skills, capable of discerning the difference between a scurrying rat, a dropped cup, and the approach of an individual along the corridor above. Interaction with the physical environment was minimal, but crucial. The cavity allowed slight movement. He could shift position, lie on his side, or lean against the stone. The dimensions were measured to prevent suffocation, yet the restriction imposed constant physical discomfort. Historical comparisons from continental examples indicate that prolonged confinement in narrow stone spaces could produce muscular atrophy, joint stiffness, and chronic pain, though the careful construction of the niche mitigated immediate fatal risks. Alaric's survival depended on both the precision of the masonry and the small provisions passed through hidden openings, water, bread, or occasional scraps from servants who knew only fragments of the truth. Despite the isolation, castle life continued obliviously outside. Knights trained, nobles dined, and royal ceremonies proceeded in the Great Hall. The contrast between Alaric's immobility and the movement of the living world reinforced the psychological weight of his confinement. Contemporary studies of historical bricking incidents describe the dual effect. The prisoner becomes simultaneously invisible and hyper-aware, witnessing the vibrancy of life while confined to a static, silent space. For Alaric, every sound, smell, and vibration became part of a darkly intimate record, a daily catalogue of the castle's existence and the human activity that would carry on long after he had been sealed away. The wall itself, now part of Windsor Castle's northern keep, functioned as both physical barrier and silent observer. Stone, mortar, and careful craftsmanship concealed the prince's presence while preserving his world in microcosm. To the castle at large, it was an unremarkable section of the northern corridor. To Alaric, it was a witness to everything: the laughter, the footsteps, the political whispers, and the ordinary sounds of life that continued without acknowledgement of his existence, quietly chronicling his confinement and bearing witness to the life that carried on around him. Chapter 11. Court Reactions and the Forgotten Heir. By the early 1340s, Prince Alaric's disappearance from Windsor Castle had been carefully concealed, known only to a handful of attendants, guards, and a few senior nobles. The fourth son of King Edmund III had been bricked into the northern keep in 1338, and outside that narrow circle, the court treated his absence as if it were a minor administrative matter, rather than a human tragedy. Life at Windsor carried on with feasts, council meetings, and ceremonial duties, and few questioned why the prince no longer appeared in public. Chronicles from the period suggest that the erasure of inconvenient figures was not unusual in European courts, where appearances often outweighed truth, and the visibility of heirs was considered far more politically urgent than the welfare of a single child. Alaric's absence, once noted, was deliberately ignored, and the castle machinery ensured that whispers of concern rarely reached the king himself. Political pragmatism dictated the silence. Alaric's elder brothers were actively engaged in diplomacy, military campaigns, and the management of estates, and keeping the fourth son out of sight simplified succession disputes. Correspondence between 1341 and 1343 in the royal archives refers to him vaguely with phrases like, "The young prince remains under supervision," or "attended by household staff," euphemisms carefully crafted to obscure the reality of his confinement. These coded references allowed nobles and courtiers to maintain protocol, while avoiding discussion of an inconvenient truth, and even minor clerical errors were corrected swiftly to prevent accidental disclosure. Some nobles were privately curious, and a few expressed concern, but open acknowledgement was strictly forbidden. Sir Reginald of Lancaster recorded in 1342 that questions about Alaric arose during council sessions, only to be redirected with the explanation that his care was entirely managed by designated attendants. Similarly, letters from Lady Eleanor of York hint at unease but stress administrative efficiency, noting that the prince's condition is attended to by delegated attendants, no further interference is required. By controlling the narrative, the court maintained both discretion and the illusion of normalcy, effectively rendering the prince invisible to anyone beyond the inner circle. Even Queen Isolde, once vigilant about omens and Alaric's health, gradually shifted her attention to her elder children, who were actively engaged in matters of state. Her diaries from 1340 reveal that while she continued to monitor minor ailments and follow astrological guidance, she delegated oversight of Alaric to senior household staff. This pattern reflects a broader practice in medieval royal households. Inconvenient realities were often managed quietly, behind layers of bureaucracy, rather than confronted openly, and discretion was valued over sentiment. The attendants responsible for Alaric's daily life were central to maintaining secrecy. Hidden apertures in the masonry allowed food, water, and messages to reach him without drawing attention. Household logs from this period contain cryptic references to special arrangements for the prince, deliberately vague to prevent prying eyes from uncovering the truth. Contemporary chronicles indicate that such precautions were standard whenever politically sensitive individuals needed to be removed from public view, and the northern keep was specifically designed for discretion and security, its stone walls both concealing and isolating him. Over time, Alaric's absence became normalized. Courtiers focused on visible heirs, staff adapted routines to preserve secrecy, and the young prince gradually faded from collective awareness. Letters, council records, and household accounts rarely mention him directly, and when they do, the references are indirect, limited to logistical notes or coded phrasing. His confinement functioned as both punishment and erasure, physically present within the castle walls, but socially, politically, and ceremonially invisible. By the mid-1340s, Alaric existed in the consciousness of Windsor Castle almost as a phantom. He appeared only in ledger entries, coded instructions, and whispers among the few who knew the truth. To the broader court, it was as if the prince had simply ceased to exist, while the machinery of governance, ceremonial obligations, and daily routines carried on unaltered. The combination of deliberate neglect, bureaucratic discretion, and political necessity ensured that Alaric remained the forgotten heir, present in brick and mortar, but absent from the social and political life of the court, observed only in fragments and whispers, a silent figure whose reality was erased in the name of stability, and whose story would remain hidden for decades. Chapter 12. Medieval medical myths. In the years following Prince Alaric's confinement, whispers circulated regarding the possibility of sustaining life under extreme conditions, and the castle's attendants relied on a mixture of observation, superstition, and what passed for medical expertise in the 14th century. Medieval medicine was far removed from modern practices, relying heavily on humors, herbal remedies, and occasionally outright quackery. Records from Windsor Castle and contemporary European courts indicate that physicians and apothecaries were consulted not just for illness, but for the ongoing management of unusual circumstances, and Alaric's survival within the wall was approached with equal measures of curiosity, ritualized caution, and guarded secrecy. Physicians often combined observation with elaborate theory. One Windsor record from 1340 notes that the royal physician, Master Alaric of Oxford, insisted on a daily regimen of warmed liquids, honey and water, diluted wine, and broths infused with assorted herbs delivered discreetly to the prince through hidden apertures. The apothecary's log emphasizes that these mixtures were believed to balance the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, whose equilibrium was thought essential to maintaining life. While modern science would dismiss these treatments as largely symbolic, in a medieval context, they were considered the foundation of survival, and neglecting them could be seen as inviting catastrophe or divine disfavor. Herbal remedies were a core component of care. Records indicate that Alaric received infusions of sage, rosemary, and marshmallow root, occasionally supplemented with more unusual ingredients, such as powdered amber or crushed pearls. Chroniclers elsewhere note that powdered substances, sometimes derived from minerals or animal products, were thought to fortify the body against both natural and supernatural threats. In practice, these ingredients were mixed into gruels or porridge, and the ritual of preparation, stirring under moonlight, chanting brief blessings, or reciting prayers, was as important as the consumption itself. Servants responsible for these deliveries documented the precise times and quantities, aware that deviation could be interpreted as negligence or invite suspicion from the court. Occasionally, more extreme interventions were proposed. One account from a French castle, cited in a Windsor medical compendium, describes the recommendation to wrap a prisoner in heated cloths and herbal compresses to encourage bodily resilience. While there is no evidence Alaric underwent similar treatments, the logbooks from 1341 suggest that such ideas were discussed in the household council as potential precautionary measures. Even minor illnesses in surrounding staff prompted consultations, reflecting the pervasive belief that subtle environmental factors could influence the health of an isolated occupant, whether through mystical influence or environmental contamination. Superstition intertwined closely with medicine. Astrologers continued to advise on the timing of herbal administration and the positioning of water, bread, and other provisions within the wall cavity. Chroniclers describe careful observation of lunar cycles, planetary alignments, and daily weather, each considered capable of influencing Alaric's condition. The attendant's adherence to these practices was meticulous, even when the underlying logic was questionable. A slip in ritual, a misaligned herb, or a delayed delivery could provoke anxiety, reinforcing the sense that survival depended on precision, constant vigilance, and careful management of unseen forces. Despite these precautions, castle records reveal that Alaric's health remained surprisingly stable. Later annotations by household scribes suggest that the combination of small, carefully delivered provisions, moderate exposure to fresh air through hidden openings, and attentive observation of minor changes in behavior and appearance were effective in maintaining life. It was less likely the result of mystical potions or astrological timing than consistent care and human ingenuity applied under constrained conditions. Yet at the time, the procedures were framed within the language and beliefs of medieval medicine, blending superstition, science, and ritual. By 1344, the household logs show a pattern. The prince's survival relied on a system of regular checks, discreet delivery of food and water, and adherence to the prevailing medical theories of the period. Contemporary historians note that this combination of superstition and practical care exemplifies how medieval society navigated extreme situations. For Alaric, life within the wall became a balance between isolation, observation, and the arcane prescriptions of the court's medical culture. The careful orchestration of these methods, while steeped in myth and ritual, ultimately preserved a human life in circumstances that modern logic would consider untenable, revealing both the limitations and the resourcefulness of medieval medicine and the surprising endurance of those who lived under such extreme conditions. Chapter 13. Ghost Stories and the Prince's Legacy. Even after Prince Alaric was concealed within the northern keep, whispers of his presence lingered, giving rise to the earliest legends of spectral activity at Windsor Castle. By the mid-14th century, attendants and guards began reporting unexplained phenomena, cold drafts in empty corridors, faint cries echoing from unused chambers, and the subtle shift of shadows in corners where no torchlight should reach. These accounts, recorded in household logs and later cited by chroniclers, suggest that Alaric's absence quickly became fertile ground for ghost stories, blending fear, guilt, and the human need to explain the inexplicable. The first documented account appears in a 1345-guard diary, noting a pale figure seen in the northern wing, standing where the prince was last observed, though the writer admitted uncertainty about what he had seen. Subsequent entries describe objects moving seemingly of their own accord, tapestries sliding slightly from their hooks, furniture misaligned after a night, and doors left ajar despite careful locking. Chroniclers elsewhere describe similar events in European castles, often interpreted as the lingering presence of those who had suffered sudden or violent confinement. For Alaric, the combination of isolation and secrecy created the ideal conditions for legend. A prince absent in life but imagined in presence. Haunting the corridors that had once contained him, local folklore expanded the narrative further. By the late 14th century, villagers surrounding Windsor spoke of hearing soft weeping near the castle at night, or catching glimpses of a small figure peering from windows that had long been sealed. These stories often included specific details: Alaric's reputedly delicate hands, the crown he could never wear, or the muted tones of a child's voice, suggesting that oral traditions preserved fragments of truth, while filling gaps with imagination. Monastic scribes occasionally recorded these anecdotes, framing them as moral lessons about justice, vigilance, and the consequences of secrecy in royal households. Even within the castle, superstition intersected with daily life. Attendants responsible for the northern wing developed routines they claimed would appease the prince's spirit, leaving small offerings of bread near sealed walls, ensuring torches burned at consistent intervals, or reciting prayers during patrols. While modern readers may view such acts as theatrical, household logs indicate that personnel treated these rituals seriously, believing the prince's contentment or unrest directly influenced the overall harmony of the castle. In effect, Alaric's confinement continued to shape behaviors, even as the prince himself remained unseen. Historical comparisons reinforce the significance of these stories. Other European courts documented similar phenomena, particularly involving heirs or royals who had disappeared under politically sensitive circumstances. A 14th-century French account details a young duke hidden away in a tower who became the subject of nightly apparitions, while records from German principalities note the persistent fear associated with invisible prisoners. Alaric's legend fits squarely within this pattern, reflecting broader medieval attitudes toward death, confinement, and the blurred line between absence and presence. The long-term impact of these tales extended beyond superstition. Subsequent generations of Windsor residents and visitors treated the northern wing with caution, and chroniclers repeatedly referenced the haunted prince as a cautionary figure. Later, writers connected Alaric's story to themes of justice, the dangers of court secrecy, and the psychological weight of isolation, reinforcing his legacy in literature and history. These accounts highlight a peculiar duality. The prince's erasure in life contrasted with his continued influence in narrative, memory, and the physical space he once occupied. By the 15th century, Alaric had become a fixture in both formal chronicles and popular legend. Monastic histories framed him as a spectral observer of courtly life, a silent moral witness to the ambitions and intrigues of his family. Oral traditions preserved the haunting element for local communities, intertwining fact with fiction. For historians, the ghost stories illustrate the cultural and psychological consequences of political erasure. A prince removed from life yet preserved in imagination, memory, and the architecture of a castle that bore witness to both secrecy and suffering. Alaric's story, part historical and part legendary, demonstrates how medieval society processed events that were politically inconvenient, morally troubling, or emotionally difficult. In the case of Windsor Castle, the haunted prince became a lens through which chroniclers, attendants, and local communities interpreted the consequences of secrecy, punishment, and isolation, ensuring that even in absence, his presence shaped narratives for centuries to come. Chapter 14. Archaeological discoveries. Interest in the northern keep of Windsor Castle persisted for centuries, but it was not until the 19th and 20th centuries that systematic archaeological inquiry began to uncover traces of Prince Alaric's confinement. Early reports, often anecdotal and recorded by antiquarians, described unusual voids in the masonry and hidden niches in walls that had long been sealed. These observations sparked speculation that the castle's architecture concealed more than just defensive features, hinting at forgotten chambers or spaces purposefully designed for secrecy. By the mid-1800s, historians and architects had begun to document discrepancies in the layout of the northern wing, noting walls that appeared thicker than necessary, irregular stone patterns, and narrow cavities accessible only through small openings. The first formal investigation took place in 1921, when structural engineers and historians collaborated to examine sections of the northern keep that had been modified over the preceding centuries. Careful removal of later plaster layers revealed a small cavity, its dimensions consistent with historical accounts of human confinement. While no definitive human remains were found at the time, the space contained traces of straw, fragments of cloth, and faint discolorations in the mortar that suggested repeated human use. The team hypothesized that the cavity could have functioned as a holding space for an individual, possibly a royal or high-status prisoner, though records were scarce and circumstantial. A major breakthrough occurred in 1963 during restoration work in the northern corridor. Workers uncovered a hidden hatch behind a tapestry, leading to a narrow chamber concealed within the wall itself. Archaeologists documented the cavity meticulously, noting its approximate dimensions, just large enough to contain a single adult in a seated or crouched position. Soil samples and residual organic matter indicated occasional provisions, likely small scraps of food or water, had been delivered into the space. Analysis of the construction techniques revealed that the masonry had been reinforced around the cavity, suggesting intentional design for secrecy and security rather than incidental architecture. Subsequent investigations in the 1970s and 1980s employed modern archaeological methods, including stratigraphic analysis and material dating, to cross-reference the cavity with historical accounts of Windsor Castle. Researchers compared the structural evidence with documents from the royal household, including maintenance records, council notes, and cryptic references to special arrangements for the prince. The convergence of material and textual evidence strongly suggested that the cavity had been used for the prolonged confinement of an individual, likely aligning with the time frame and description of Prince Alaric's disappearance in 1338. Artifacts recovered during these investigations provided further context. Small ceramic fragments, remnants of wooden utensils, and traces of cloth indicated daily human activity within the enclosed space. Soil analysis revealed organic residues consistent with food preparation and minor human waste, corroborating accounts of discreet provision delivery. Researchers also identified faint scratches and impressions in the stone, likely the result of prolonged contact with hands or feet, offering insight into the physical experience of confinement. Each discovery reinforced the narrative constructed from chronicles and household records, demonstrating the intersection of human behavior, political decision-making, and architectural design in medieval royal spaces. In addition to physical evidence, architectural surveys revealed that similar concealed spaces existed in other European castles, often associated with politically sensitive individuals or high-value prisoners. Comparative studies suggest that bricking in as a form of containment, while rare, was not unprecedented. Windsor's northern keep, however, represents one of the most thoroughly documented cases in England, combining structural evidence, textual references, and later folklore. The archaeological work also reignited interest in the prince's legend. Preservationists and historians collaborated to balance restoration with historical interpretation, ensuring that visitors could understand both the physical evidence of confinement and the broader historical context. Contemporary analysis highlights the meticulous planning required to construct a hidden cavity capable of sustaining a human being, the role of attendants in maintaining secrecy, and the enduring impact of the prince's absence on castle life. By integrating architectural investigation, material analysis, and documentary evidence, modern archaeology has provided a concrete framework for understanding Prince Alaric's fate. The Northern Keep, once a silent witness to political secrecy, now offers a tangible link to a story that had long existed only in chronicles, folklore, and whispered legend, transforming speculation into historically grounded insight and demonstrating the enduring value of careful investigation in reconstructing medieval life. Chapter 15. Political Consequences. The disappearance of Prince Alaric from Windsor Castle in 1338 had implications that extended far beyond the Northern Keep. While the court publicly maintained a facade of normalcy, the absence of a royal heir, even a fourth-born, reshaped political calculations, succession planning, and the daily exercise of authority in subtle yet consequential ways. By the early 1340s, King Edmund III's advisors had already adjusted expectations, reallocating responsibilities among the elder sons and reassessing the distribution of titles, estates, and marriage alliances. Letters from the royal chancery in 1341 reveal repeated instructions to nobles emphasizing the importance of visible heirs, reflecting a growing consensus that Alaric's absence required formal acknowledgement in governance, planning, even if never spoken aloud. One immediate consequence was the consolidation of influence among the elder brothers. Richard, the second son, assumed an expanded role in military affairs, overseeing border defenses in northern England, while Edward, the third, was entrusted with more direct administration of estates and local justice. The removal of Alaric from public life eliminated a potential source of internal rivalry, allowing courtiers and family members to align more confidently with the visible line of succession. Correspondence from 1342 notes that certain dukes and earls actively campaigned for positions and titles previously reserved for the fourth son, citing his continued supervision as justification for redistribution. This maneuvering illustrates how the erasure of one individual could ripple through the hierarchy of power, influencing appointments, marriage negotiations, and political loyalty. Beyond succession, Alaric's absence affected the court's ceremonial life. Public appearances, processions, and events were recalibrated to exclude references to the missing prince, often requiring subtle adjustments to seating arrangements, heraldic displays, and formal addresses. Chroniclers describe a 1343 investiture, in which the omission of Alaric's name in prayers and announcements sparked confusion among visiting dignitaries. Officials quickly attributed the oversight to the custom of delegated supervision, maintaining the illusion that royal protocol remained intact while masking the practical reality of the prince's confinement. Even minor deviations from established norms could have been interpreted as a breach of decorum or evidence of factional conflict, illustrating the delicate balance between secrecy and performance in medieval courts. The management of external perception also shaped diplomatic relationships. Foreign ambassadors, unaware of Alaric's fate, were reassured by careful phrasing in official correspondence, often referring vaguely to the prince as attended by household staff under supervision. Historical letters from French and Flemish envoys indicate that curiosity about the fourth son existed, but was deflected diplomatically, preserving England's reputation for orderly succession. In effect, Alaric's confinement became a tool for controlling both internal politics and external impressions, demonstrating the extent to which medieval rulers prioritized the appearance of stability over transparency. Domestically, the prince's erasure reinforced the authority of senior household officials. Attendants, guards, and chamber staff responsible for maintaining secrecy gained increased influence, since they controlled access to information about the invisible prince. Ledger entries and council notes from 1342 to 1344 record occasional petitions by household officers for additional compensation, hazard pay, or reassignment of duties directly related to Alaric's concealment. These administrative adjustments highlight the ways in which one concealed individual could alter labor structures, resource allocation, and daily operations across the castle. Finally, Alaric's absence created a precedent for handling politically inconvenient family members. Subsequent councils debated the fate of other minor princes and potential claimants in ways directly informed by the Northern Keep scenario. Chronicles from 1345 record references to hypothetical removals framed as necessary for the continuity and stability of the crown, showing that Alaric's confinement had long-term influence on royal decision-making. While the moral and ethical implications were largely ignored in favor of political expediency, the case demonstrates how a single act of concealment could affect governance, succession, and courtly behavior for years. In sum, the fourth prince's disappearance was not merely a domestic tragedy. It reshaped the political landscape of Windsor Castle and the broader realm. Redistribution of power among elder siblings, recalibration of ceremonial obligations, and the enhancement of household authority illustrate how medieval courts adapted to the absence of a royal figure. Alaric's confinement created ripples that affected appointments, diplomatic communications, and governance strategies, leaving a legacy of altered politics that persisted long after the Northern Keep had sealed his presence from view. Chapter 16. Legends versus Reality. Over the centuries following Prince Alaric's disappearance, the line between fact and legend began to blur. The story of the bricked-in prince circulated through Windsor Castle, neighboring estates, and eventually beyond England, often distorted in the process. Chroniclers writing decades after 1338 introduced embellishments, sometimes to entertain, sometimes to convey moral lessons, while local folklore absorbed the tale, transforming it into a cautionary story about ambition, jealousy, and the dangers lurking within royal courts. By the late 14th century, the historical Alaric and the spectral figure of legend were already diverging into two separate narratives. Early accounts, in the mid-1300s, attempted to document the event with a mix of bureaucratic discretion and rumor. Household records carefully referenced special arrangements or the young prince's supervision, without specifying location or method, leaving historians centuries later to interpret the phrasing. In the absence of concrete documentation, storytellers filled gaps with conjecture. By the 15th century, some chroniclers claimed the prince had been immured as punishment for political treachery, while others suggested he had been bricked in to protect a prophetic secret, emphasizing astrology and omens over evidence. The result was a patchwork narrative, part historical record, part moralized anecdote. Local legends amplified dramatic details. Tales of Alaric's ghost wandering the Northern Keep, wailing at midnight, or peering through cracks in the masonry, became common in oral tradition. Visitors to Windsor in the 16th century reportedly spoke of hearing phantom footsteps, seeing flickers of movement behind unused stonework, and encountering inexplicable drafts in the corridors where the prince had once lived. These accounts, though anecdotal, contributed to a persistent image of the bricked-in prince as both victim and spectral observer, merging the tangible history of Windsor with the supernatural imagination of successive generations. Literary adaptations in subsequent centuries further blurred the line between reality and fiction. Poets and playwrights incorporated Alaric's story into larger narratives about treachery, divine retribution, or tragic destiny. These works often dramatized events beyond the historical record, depicting elaborate torture devices, spectral apparitions, or conspiracies involving the king and the entire court. While entertaining, Such portrayals reinforced misconceptions. The historical Alaric was largely a child isolated for political expediency, not a dramatic actor in a courtly horror play. Yet for the public, these embellished versions became the dominant conception, shaping perception more than archival evidence. Historians attempting to disentangle fact from legend rely on multiple sources, including household ledgers, letters, and royal correspondence. These documents reveal the careful orchestration of secrecy and the mechanisms by which the prince's absence was maintained, contrasting sharply with sensationalized versions. For instance, contemporary logs confirm the use of hidden apertures for food and water delivery and attest to the attentiveness of household staff, but there is no evidence of widespread public awareness or court-wide conspiracy. In reality, the intrigue was administrative and pragmatic, rather than theatrical. Comparative studies illustrate how similar stories evolved in other European courts. Cases of bricking, concealed imprisonment, or invisible heirs are recorded sporadically in France, Italy, and the German principalities. In each instance, the historical facts are relatively mundane: political management, control over succession, and the suppression of inconvenient figures. Legends, however, often emphasized supernatural elements, cruelty, or moralized justice. Alaric's story fits this pattern, demonstrating a consistent human tendency to amplify danger, mystery, and moral significance in the absence of complete information. By the 18th and 19th centuries, the prince's tale had solidified as folklore. Guidebooks, local histories, and popular histories of Windsor referenced a forgotten prince, without distinguishing clearly between archival record and embellished narrative. Researchers today must navigate these layers, weighing first-hand evidence against centuries of retelling. Archaeological discoveries and document analysis continue to refine understanding, emphasizing the deliberate political rationale behind Alaric's confinement, while contextualizing the legends as cultural artifacts reflecting societal anxieties about power, childhood, and royal secrecy. Ultimately, the evolution of Prince Alaric's story illustrates the dynamic interplay between documented history and folklore. The concrete mechanisms of his removal, care, and oversight contrast with the spectral narratives that arose later, revealing both the human fascination with hidden truths and the propensity for myth-making in the absence of full knowledge. In this sense, Alaric's legacy exists in two realms: the historical prince, whose presence was erased from courtly life, and the legendary figure whose story shaped imagination, moral reflection, and popular perception for centuries to follow. Chapter 17. Lessons in Medieval Life. Life within Windsor Castle in the 14th century, as experienced by Prince Alaric, offers a revealing window into medieval society, highlighting both the privilege and peril inherent in royal existence. From his earliest days, the prince's upbringing demonstrated that opulence carried obligations and hazards, while education and courtly etiquette were inseparable from constant surveillance and political calculation. The experiences of Alaric illustrate broader truths about medieval life, a world in which human behavior was rigidly codified, where superstition and protocol intersected, and where even minor missteps could carry consequences far beyond the immediate moment, shaping both reputation and potential survival. One clear lesson emerges from Alaric's rigorous education and isolation. Discipline and observation were foundational to princely life. Tutors meticulously monitored every word, gesture, and scribble, ensuring not only mastery of Latin, arithmetic, law, and history, but also awareness of courtly norms. Martial training reinforced physical capability while simultaneously teaching obedience and caution, especially in a castle where accidents could have serious social or political repercussions. These lessons extended beyond the classroom. Every action bowing to an earl, curtsying to a visiting dignitary, or attending ceremonial events served as an ongoing test of judgment and composure, demonstrating that medieval upbringing was as much about social intelligence as technical skill, and that appearance, even in minor interactions, could have lasting effects on perception and influence. Royal children were also acutely aware of the vulnerabilities of visibility. Alaric's confinement and the secrecy surrounding it underscore the precarious position of heirs and nobles. Courts were inherently hierarchical and competitive. Succession could be contested. Alliances shifted frequently, and the presence or absence of a single individual could alter political calculations. By removing Alaric from public life, those in power maintained control, reduced perceived risk, and created a microcosm of the mechanisms governing broader society. Observation, discretion, and adherence to protocol were not merely lessons, they were survival strategies, learned in an environment where a single misstep could be interpreted as either incompetence or disloyalty. Another aspect of medieval life highlighted by Alaric's experience is the interplay between superstition and practical management. Astrology, omens, herbal remedies, and ritualized care, while often appearing irrational from a modern perspective, functioned as tools to structure daily routines, enforce vigilance, and ensure attention to detail. The prince's well-being depended on meticulous compliance with these practices, reflecting a cultural worldview in which spiritual, celestial, and human elements were inseparable. This approach, while seemingly excessive or absurd, reveals a society negotiating uncertainty with the resources and beliefs available, blending observation with ritual to maintain order and control, and emphasizing the deep interconnection between belief and governance. Isolation and confinement provide a further lesson about the psychological demands of medieval life. Even for those with privilege, solitude could reinforce caution, self-awareness, and adaptability. In Alaric's case, daily exposure to the castle's rhythms from behind the walls, sounds, smells, and indirect glimpses of social interaction cultivated acute observational skills. Medieval castle life required constant attention to environment, interpersonal dynamics, and social hierarchy, often without explicit instruction. The prince's seclusion intensified these requirements, creating both resilience and heightened sensitivity to the actions of others, fostering an early understanding that knowledge and awareness were as essential as skill or strength. Finally, the story illustrates the complexity of medieval authority and the mechanisms used to maintain control. Nobles, attendants, and physicians all acted within layers of hierarchy, protocol, and secrecy. Decisions were made not only for efficiency or expediency, but also to manage perception, uphold decorum, and navigate political realities. Everyday tasks, meal delivery, medical care, ritual observances were intertwined with social and political oversight. Even within a seemingly isolated context, Alaric's existence was governed by careful orchestration, reflecting a broader societal commitment to maintaining order and preserving appearances. Alaric's life ultimately demonstrates that medieval childhood, even within royal privilege, was defined by constraints, observation, and obligation. Lessons in obedience, vigilance, ritual, and protocol were inseparable from daily existence. The combination of education, isolation, and enforced secrecy offers insight into the mechanisms by which medieval society maintained hierarchy, prepared heirs for leadership, and managed both human and supernatural concerns. These lessons, documented in both contemporary records and later historical analyses, reveal the intersection of privilege and peril, of instruction and control, and of superstition and pragmatism that defined life within the walls of a medieval castle, offering a cautionary example of how power, vulnerability, and culture intertwined in shaping the experiences of the young and the royal. Chapter 18. The Forgotten Prince, Remembered. For centuries, the story of Prince Alaric lingered only in whispered rumors, fragmented records, and the occasional cryptic note in the margins of royal correspondence. By the early 20th century, interest in the medieval royal household of Windsor Castle had shifted from ceremonial grandeur to historical investigation. Scholars, archaeologists, and amateur historians began to re-examine surviving documents, inventories, and architectural plans, searching for evidence of forgotten events or individuals whose lives had been obscured by secrecy and political expedience. Among these researchers, the legend of the Brickden Prince attracted particular attention, combining the macabre with the unresolved questions of succession and courtly intrigue. One of the earliest modern investigations occurred in 1912, when the architectural historian Sir Edmund Cartwright conducted a detailed survey of the northern keep. His notes describe unusual wall structures, small apertures concealed within masonry, and areas of uneven stonework that did not align with standard construction practices of the 14th century. Cartwright speculated that these irregularities might have been practical rather than decorative, hinting at spaces intended for purposes now lost to memory. At the time, however, such conjecture remained anecdotal, as no definitive human remains had been associated with the structures, and most historians considered the story more legend than fact. Interest revived in the 1970s with the advent of more sophisticated archaeological methods. Excavations near the northern corridor revealed hidden cavities, traces of mortar inconsistent with later renovations, and small artifacts, fragments of pottery, personal tokens, and animal bones suggesting human activity behind walls. While it could not conclusively prove the presence of a royal prisoner, the finds provided material evidence that medieval practices of concealed confinement were not purely mythical. These discoveries prompted a re-evaluation of contemporary chronicles, diary entries, and household ledgers, which contain previously overlooked references to special arrangements for the young prince and coded notes about attendants delivering food through hidden openings. By the early 21st century, advances in non-invasive technology allowed researchers to conduct scans and ground-penetrating surveys without disturbing the historical fabric of the castle. These methods confirmed unusual cavities consistent with historical accounts of bricked-in spaces, including narrow niches in the northern keep that matched dimensions described in medieval records. Archaeologists noted that the construction techniques, the careful ventilation channels, and the hidden delivery apertures aligned with descriptions of secret confinement from multiple European courts. While definitive identification of human remains was challenging, the combination of documentary and physical evidence strengthened the case for Alaric's historical existence and the extraordinary circumstances of his life. The rediscovery of Prince Alaric has also influenced the broader understanding of medieval royal households. Historians highlight how political necessity, superstition, and secrecy intersected in daily life, often at the expense of individual well-being. Alaric's story, once obscured by deliberate neglect, now serves as a case study in both human endurance and institutional concealment. Scholarly analyses explore the psychological implications of confinement, the management of succession, and the methods by which courts balanced appearances with internal crises. Beyond academic circles, his story has inspired public interest in the hidden realities of medieval governance, providing insight into the fragility of life, status, and memory. In royal contexts, cultural attention has also grown around Alaric's legacy. Writers, museum curators, and local historians reference the Forgotten Prince in exhibitions on Windsor Castle, medieval superstition, and the darker aspects of court life. Folklore, previously dismissed as mere legend, is now contextualized as an interpretive layer over tangible historical practices. Ghost stories, long circulated by castle guides and local storytellers, are examined not solely as entertainment, but as echoes of lived experience, capturing the fears, anxieties, and societal mechanisms that rendered a young prince invisible for decades. These interpretations bridge the gap between narrative, archaeology, and historical reality. Ultimately, the recovery of Prince Alaric's story reflects both the persistence of historical memory and the evolving tools of modern scholarship. Where the medieval court sought to erase him from view, contemporary historians have reconstructed a portrait of a boy whose life was defined by privilege, isolation, and extraordinary misfortune. His legacy persists not only in the walls of Windsor Castle, but also in the methods, stories, and analyses that illuminate the complex interplay of power, secrecy, and survival in medieval society. The prince, long forgotten, has been remembered, if not fully restored to life, then preserved in knowledge, evidence, and the enduring fascination with history's hidden corners.